He walked 3 days without his horse, and the prairie was too wide to carry a heart that heavy. But he was unaware of the situations that would be the beginning of a new hope. The Montana sky burned orange as the sun bled into the edge of the world, casting long shadows across the endless expanse of grass and dust. Clint Rowan walked slow, each step deliberate and measured, dust clinging to the sweat on his boots like memories that wouldn't let go. The leather was cracked now, worn thin from years of stirrups and trail riding, but they still held together, just like the man who wore them. He had buried Dusty, his stallion, just 3 dawns ago near a cedar tree that stood alone against the vastness, wrapped his reins around a branch and whispered thanks before he let the shovel fall into earth that seemed too hard for such a gentle soul. The grave was simple, just a mound of stones and prairie dirt, but Clint had carved Dusty's name into the cedar's bark with his knife, the letters deep enough to last through seasons of wind and weather. He'd stayed there until the sun set that first night, talking to the horse like he always had, telling him about the trail ahead and the uncertainty that stretched out like the horizon itself. When morning came, he'd shouldered his pack and walked away, but the echo of hoofbeats seemed to follow him with every step he took across the dry ground. They had ridden together for 11 years through territories that changed like the seasons, from the green valleys of Oregon to the red rocks of Utah, from cattle drives that lasted months to quiet nights under stars that seemed close enough to touch. Dusty had been more than a horse. He had been company when the silence grew too thick, compass when the trails twisted into uncertainty, and conscience when the choices got hard. The stallion had known his moods better than most people, would sidle close when grief sat heavy on Clint's shoulders, or step light and eager when adventure called from the next ridge. Now the saddle was gone, sold to a rancher in the last town for enough money to buy supplies and a few decent meals, and every step Clint took echoed in silence that seemed to swallow sound itself. He didn't even know why he kept going, one boot after another across ground that stretched endlessly in all directions. The town of Silvervale was still 20 miles east, across ridge and scrub and heat that shimmered like water in the distance. He had no job lined up there, no family waiting with open arms and a hot meal. Just a gut feeling that told him to keep walking, that somewhere ahead lay something he couldn't yet name. That, and the emptiness that needed filling, a hollow space in his chest where companionship used to live, where the steady rhythm of hoofbeats had once provided a heartbeat for his days. The sun climbed higher, turning the sky from orange to pale blue, and Clint adjusted his hat to keep the glare from his eyes. His water was running low, but he'd learned to ration it carefully over the years, taking small sips that barely wet his lips but kept the worst of the thirst at bay. The prairie grass whispered in the wind, a sound like distant conversation, and sometimes he found himself listening for familiar voices in that rustling, old friends from the trail, fellow riders who'd shared campfires and stories under the endless sky. It was near dusk, as coyotes began to test the edges of the sky with their haunting calls, that Clint heard it, a horse's cry that cut through the evening air like a blade through silk, not a whinny of greeting or recognition, not a distant call from some hidden herd. It was raw, pained, like a soul tearing loose from ribs, like suffering given voice in the growing twilight. Clint stopped cold, his hand instinctively moving to the knife at his belt. He'd heard that sound before years ago when a mare had gotten caught in a flash flood and fought against the current until her strength gave out. It was the sound of an animal in desperate trouble, and it pulled at something deep in his chest, something that had been dormant since he'd walked away from Dusty's grave. The sound came again, muffled behind a thicket of thornbrush and sage, and Clint felt his heart quicken. He crouched low, moving with the careful silence he'd learned from years of tracking game and avoiding trouble. The thorns caught at his clothes as he pushed through the dry branches, their sharp points finding every gap in his shirt and vest, but he pressed on until he found him. A young chestnut stallion, wild-eyed and trembling, one leg caught in a cruel tangle of rusted barbed wire that had probably been left by some long-gone homesteader. Blood oozed from the gash where the metal had bitten deep, dark against the horse's copper coat. The animal snorted and flinched at Clint's presence, nostrils flared wide, eyes darting left and right like a trapped thing looking for escape. Every muscle in the horse's body was taut with pain and fear, and Clint could see the exhaustion in his stance. He'd been fighting the wire for hours, maybe longer. Clint raised his hands slowly, palms out, and spoke in the low, gentle voice he'd always used with Dusty. "Easy, boy, I ain't gonna hurt you." The words came naturally, though his throat felt thick with emotion. "I know you're scared, I know it hurts, but I'm gonna help you." The horse's breathing slowed just enough, though his eyes remained fixed on Clint with a mixture of wariness and desperate hope. Clint took a step closer, then another, talking continuously in that same soothing tone. He'd approached hundreds of horses in his lifetime, but this one felt different. There was an intelligence in those dark eyes, a depth that spoke of more than simple animal instinct. Clint moved in slow, pulled out his flask, and let the animal sniff it before pouring a bit over the wound. The horse tensed at the touch of water on raw flesh, but didn't try to bolt. Instead, he seemed to understand that this strange human was trying to help, not harm. With careful precision, Clint took his blade and gently cut the wire, working strand by strand to free the trapped leg. The horse whined again, a sound that went straight to Clint's heart but didn't pull away. "There we go," Clint murmured as the last of the wire fell away. "You're free now, free to run if you want." But the horse didn't run. Instead, he stood there on three legs, the injured one held gingerly off the ground, and looked at Clint with something that might have been gratitude. The leg was bad, torn deep, with ragged edges that would need careful tending. No walking tonight, that was certain. The animal would need rest and care if he was going to heal properly. Clint gathered what dry branches he could find and made camp beside the horse, building a small fire as the last light faded from the sky. He used his bedroll to create a windbreak and settled in for the night, watching the animal breathe, his chest rising slow but steady. The horse had lain down nearby, close enough that Clint could reach out and touch him if needed, but far enough away that he didn't feel trapped or threatened. That night, under a quiet moon that cast silver light across the prairie, Clint sat by the fire, feeding it small sticks and listening to the night sounds around them. Coyotes called in the distance, their voices rising and falling like a primitive song, and somewhere an owl hooted from a hidden perch. The horse's breathing was even now, and occasionally he would snort softly in his sleep, perhaps dreaming of green pastures and clear streams. "You showed up just when I needed something to believe in," Clint whispered to the sleeping animal. "Maybe that's how these things work. Maybe we find each other when we need it most." The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up into the darkness, and Clint found himself thinking about the strange turns life could take. 3 days ago, he'd been a man alone, walking toward an uncertain future with nothing but grief for company. Now he sat watching over an injured horse, feeling more purposeful than he had since Dusty's passing. It wasn't coincidence. He'd stopped believing in coincidence years ago. This was something else, something deeper. 3 days passed in a rhythm of care and quiet companionship. Clint fed the stallion water from his hat, letting the animal drink deeply from the makeshift bowl. He boiled grass in an old tin pot, letting the horse chew the softened pulp when his own supplies ran low. The animal seemed to understand that this strange human was helping him, and he never showed aggression or fear. Instead, he would nicker softly when Clint approached, and sometimes nuzzle his shoulder with a velvet nose. Clint dressed the wound twice daily, cleaning away the dried blood and applying what salve he had in his pack. The gash was healing well, the edges beginning to close, and the swelling had gone down considerably. He talked to the horse while he worked, telling him about Dusty and the trails they'd ridden together, about the towns they'd seen and the people they'd met. The animal listened with pricked ears, as if he understood every word. On the third morning, Clint awoke to find the horse standing on 3 legs, the injured one gingerly touching ground. There was weight on it now, tentative but real, and when the horse took a careful step, he didn't immediately lift the leg again. "Well, I'll be," Clint breathed, and the horse turned to look at him with those intelligent dark eyes. "You're a fighter, ain't you? Just like someone else I used to know." He packed what little gear he had, tied it into a bundle, and made a sling out of his old saddle blanket. The horse walked beside him, limping but moving with purpose. Not aimless wandering like Clint had been doing, not random meandering. This was directed movement, as if the animal knew exactly where he was going. They should have been heading east toward Silvervale, toward the town where Clint had planned to look for work and maybe find a place to settle for a while. But the horse kept veering north, his steps sure and steady despite the healing leg. Every time Clint tried to pull him back toward the town, the stallion resisted, not violently, but with a kind of insistence that seemed too purposeful to ignore. "You're walking like a creature who knows where he's going," Clint muttered, studying the horse's determined gait. "Like you got business somewhere." The animal's ears flicked back at the sound of his voice, but he didn't change direction. If anything, his pace quickened slightly, as if he was eager to reach whatever destination he had in mind. Clint had seen this behavior before, in horses heading home after being lost, in animals following some instinct that ran deeper than human understanding. After a half-day more of this northward trek, watching the horse's unwavering determination, Clint gave in. "Fine," he said, adjusting his pack and falling into step beside the stallion. "You lead, I'll follow, but I hope you know what you're doing, because I sure don't." So they walked together through the changing landscape, the horse setting the pace and direction, while Clint provided companionship and care. They passed through narrow canyons where the walls rose high on either side, casting cool shadows that provided relief from the sun. They crossed bone-dry creek beds where the only signs of water were the smooth stones polished by long-ago floods. They climbed a ridge where vultures circled slow and patient, their dark shapes cutting lazy circles against the blue sky. The horse never faltered in his direction, never showed doubt or hesitation. He moved with the certainty of a creature following an internal compass, and Clint found himself trusting that instinct completely. There was something about this animal that reminded him of Dusty, not in appearance, but in the quiet confidence with which he moved through the world. Just as twilight kissed the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, they came to a grove of dead cottonwoods that stood like skeletal sentinels against the darkening sky. And there, tucked between the lifeless trees, they found a caravan. It was old, the wood rotted and weathered, with no markings or decorations to identify its owners. The wagon wheels were sunk deep into the dry earth, as if the convoy had been there for weeks or months without moving. There was no campfire, no guards, no signs of life at all. The silence was thick and oppressive, broken only by the whisper of wind through the dead branches overhead. Something about the scene made Clint's skin crawl, a wrongness that he couldn't quite name but felt in his bones. The horse had stopped at the edge of the grove, his body tense and alert. His nostrils flared as he scented the air, and Clint could see the whites of his eyes. Whatever this place was, the animal didn't like it any more than Clint did. Moving carefully, Clint approached the wagons, his hand resting on his knife handle. The first wagon was empty except for some rotting supplies and a few broken pieces of equipment. The second held nothing but shadows and the musty smell of abandonment, but at the back of the last wagon he found something that made his blood run cold. A cage. Iron bars welded together with crude workmanship, the metal stained with rust and something darker. And inside it, barely visible in the growing darkness, was a young boy. He was filthy, his clothes torn and stained, his face marked with bruises that spoke of rough treatment. He couldn't have been more than 12 years old, and he was barely conscious, his small body huddled in one corner of the cage. Clint's heart dropped like a stone into still water. He'd heard stories of this kind of thing, traders who dealt in human cargo, selling children to work in mines or worse. But seeing it with his own eyes, seeing this small broken figure behind iron bars, filled him with a rage that burned hotter than any fire. The boy looked up at the sound of Clint's approach, squinting against the low light. His eyes were dull with exhaustion and despair, but there was still a spark of life in them. "He brought you," the boy whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. Clint turned, confused, and saw the horse standing behind him, still, silent, watching. The animal's eyes were fixed on the cage, and there was something in his stance that spoke of recognition, of purpose fulfilled. The boy blinked, and suddenly his eyes went wide with disbelief and hope. "That's Morningfire, my horse!" The name hung in the air like a revelation, and suddenly everything made sense. The horse's determined direction, his unwavering purpose, the way he'd led Clint straight to this place. This wasn't coincidence or chance. This was a rescue mission, orchestrated by an animal who had refused to abandon the boy who belonged to him. Clint didn't hesitate. He drew his knife and went to work on the lock, his hands shaking with urgency and anger. The metal was old and corroded, and it took several minutes of careful work to cut through the mechanism. When the lock finally gave way, the cage door swung open with a screech of protest. The boy tumbled into Clint's arms, sobbing quietly, clinging like he'd known him all his life. He was lighter than he should have been, his body showing the effects of poor food and harsh treatment, but he was alive, and that was what mattered. "He came back," the boy said between sobs. "I told him to run when they took me. I told him to go home, but he found you." Clint held the child carefully, checking for serious injuries while trying to process what he was hearing. The horse, Morningfire, had been separated from this boy and had somehow found Clint, led him here to this place. It was beyond remarkable. It was miraculous. "Who did this to you?" Clint asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Traders," the boy whispered. "Bad men. They were gonna sell me to the mines down south. My tribe, they think I'm dead. I heard them talking about it." Clint's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Rage simmered just beneath the surface, but he forced himself to stay calm for the boy's sake. There would be time for anger later. Right now, this child needed care and safety. "What's your name, son?" "Tama," the boy replied, his voice growing stronger. "Son of White Elk, chief of the Fire Wind tribe. They spent the night in the shadows of the dead trees, hidden from view but ready to run if the traders returned." Clint kept watch while Tama slept, the boy curled up next to Morningfire like he'd done it 1,000 times before. The horse stood guard over them both, his ears constantly moving, alert for any sound that might signal danger. The traders never came back. Whether they'd abandoned the wagons or were simply away on other business, Clint didn't know and didn't care. When dawn broke over the prairie, he helped Tama to his feet and prepared for the journey ahead. At dawn, Clint lifted the boy onto Morningfire's back, surprised by how naturally the horse accepted his young rider. The animal's entire demeanor changed with Tama on his back. His head came up, his step became more confident, and he moved with the grace of a creature who had found his purpose again. They headed west, toward the territory where Clint hoped the Fire Wind tribe still made their home. The journey would be dangerous, but staying near the caravan would be worse. As they rode, Clint walking alongside the horse, Tama told him stories of his people, of their customs and their connection to the land. It took 2 days of careful travel, moving slowly to avoid detection and to accommodate Morningfire's healing leg. They traveled by night when possible, resting during the heat of the day in whatever shelter they could find. Tama grew stronger with every mile, his natural resilience shining through despite the ordeal he'd endured. The boy told Clint about his father, White Elk, and how he'd been captured while hunting alone, taken by traders who specialized in selling native children to work in dangerous mines. He spoke of how Morningfire had been a gift from his grandfather, trained from birth to be his companion and protector. "When I was taken, Morningfire kicked 3 men and ran," Tama said, his voice filled with pride despite the pain of the memory. "I thought he was gone forever, but he came back, With you." Clint stayed silent, but he felt something shifting in him, something bigger than coincidence, deeper than chance. This was about connection, about bonds that transcended species and understanding. Morningfire had found him not by accident, but by design, guided by loyalty and love that couldn't be broken by distance or danger. When they finally crested the last hill before the Fire-Wind encampment, Clint's breath caught in his throat. Below them, spread across a wide valley, were dozens of teepees arranged in careful circles around central fires. Horses grazed in makeshift corrals, and people moved between the dwellings with the easy familiarity of home. Morningfire whinnied loud and proud, his call echoing across the valley. The sound was answered immediately by other horses, and then by human voices raised in excitement and disbelief. People began pouring out of the teepees, pointing and shouting, and Clint could see the joy spreading through the camp like wildfire. The camp erupted in cries of celebration as they recognized both horse and rider. Children ran alongside them as they descended into the valley, their laughter mixing with the adult voices raised in thanksgiving. Dogs barked and horses neighed, and the entire encampment seemed to vibrate with joy. White Elk was a tall man, weathered by years of leadership and responsibility, but his dignity crumbled completely when Thomas slid from Morningfire's back and threw his arms around his father. The chief wept openly, holding his son as if he would never let him go again, and Clint felt his own eyes burning with unshed tears. The reunion was everything Clint had hoped for and more. Tama was surrounded by family and friends, all talking at once, touching him to make sure he was real, bringing him food and water and clean clothes. The boy's mother appeared, a woman whose face showed the strain of weeks of grief, and she too broke down when she saw her son alive and whole. Clint stood back, unsure of his place in this moment of family joy. He'd done what needed doing, but now he felt like an intruder in someone else's celebration. But Morningfire walked to him and stopped, refusing to leave his side even when Tama called to him. The horse's loyalty was absolute, it seemed. He'd brought Clint here for a reason, and that reason wasn't finished yet. Even after being reunited with his young master, Morningfire stayed close to the man who'd helped him, who trusted him enough to follow where he led. Later, as the celebration continued around the sacred fire, White Elk approached Clint with ceremony and respect. The chief's face was grave despite his joy, and his words carried the weight of tribal custom and personal gratitude. "You brought back 2 sons," he said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "One born to me, one gifted by the spirits." Clint felt uncomfortable with the attention, with the implication that he'd done something extraordinary. "I just followed the horse," he said almost sheepishly. "He's the one who knew where to go." White Elk smiled, an expression that transformed his weathered features. "Sometimes," he replied, "the horse follows the spirit of a man, not the path. Morningfire saw something in you that called to him." The chief gestured to the horse, who stood quietly at Clint's side. "In our tradition, when a horse chooses a rider, that choice is sacred. It cannot be undone by human will or tribal law." He nodded solemnly. "Morningfire has chosen. We honor his will." The words hung in the air like a blessing, and Clint felt something settle in his chest, a sense of belonging that he hadn't experienced since Dusty's death. This wasn't just about rescuing a boy or healing a wounded animal. This was about finding his place in the world again, about discovering that some bonds transcend species and circumstance. The next morning, as the camp stirred to life around them, Clint saddled Morningfire for the first time. The horse stood perfectly still, accepting the familiar weight of leather and metal as if he'd been waiting for this moment. When Clint swung up into the saddle, the feeling was like coming home. Morningfire beneath him felt like destiny, like the continuation of a story that had been interrupted but not ended. The horse's gait was smooth and confident, his healing leg showing no signs of weakness or pain. They moved together with an ease that spoke of natural partnership, of 2 souls finding their rhythm. Tama waved from the edge of the camp, already wearing the beads and feathers of his people again, his face bright with health and happiness. He was laughing with other children, playing games that had been interrupted by his captivity, but now resumed as if he'd never been gone. The sight filled Clint with satisfaction deeper than any he'd known. Clint gave a final tip of his hat to White Elk, who had come to see them off. The chief smiled and raised his hand in farewell, then spoke words that would stay with Clint forever. "Wherever you ride, the fire wind rides with you." As they rode into the sunrise, the sky painted in shades of gold and pink, Clint felt the last of his grief lifting like morning mist. The emptiness in his chest was filled now, not with the memory of what he'd lost, but with the promise of what he'd found. Morning Fire tossed his head and quickened his pace, eager for the trail ahead. "Guess we saved each other, huh?" Clint whispered to the horse, and Morning Fire's ears flicked back in acknowledgement. They galloped faster then, toward a trail neither of them had planned for but both knew was right. The prairie stretched endlessly ahead, full of possibilities and new adventures, and Clint Rowan was no longer a man walking alone. He was a rider again, with a horse beneath him and the wind in his face, following a path that had chosen him as much as he had chosen it.